When it comes to Oklahoma's racial history, a lot of attention is paid to Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood Massacre was the worst of its kind to ever take place in the United States. It was also the only time in U.S. history that planes were used to firebomb an American town. But all over the state, there were places that openly and violently discriminated against the black population. All across the former Indian Territory, there is a history of killing or removing its native and minority populations. The towns of Edmond and Norman, Oklahoma, would boast that they were 100% white. How did they achieve this? Let's talk about the hidden history of Oklahoma, a state marred by racial and native violence. A sundown town is any jurisdiction with all white residents that discriminate against minority populations using backward local laws, violence, and threats of violence. Many of these places had signs like the one pictured above. Any minority, mainly African Americans, caught in these towns after dark would be arrested and chased out. Edmond had sundown laws on the books from 1905 until 1974. Edmond would allow some black people to work and to sometimes shop in town, but they would often be run out by local police. The town recently elected its first black mayor, Daryl Davis. He wants to acknowledge and talk openly about the history of Edmond. For hundreds of years, Oklahoma was a place very few people tried to settle. The Plains tribes were known for attacking many people that would venture into their borders. Many other tribes also dotted the territory, from the far west of the state to the far east. But after the Indian Removal Act, thousands of natives were forced to walk hundreds of miles to Oklahoma from the eastern U.S. on the Trail of Tears. This giant piece of land that was Oklahoma Territory was supposed to be a place for Native Americans where no white man would intrude upon them. However, even this terrible compromise would not last very long. For the last half of the 19th century, the tribes were devastated by war and disease. Oklahoma has never been an easy place to live. Resources can be hard to come by. The landscape is beautiful, but it can be incredibly unforgiving. Many early white settlers struggled with hunger when they attempted to settle here. Many Native people during this time owned slaves. The Cherokee tribe specifically enslaved more than 4,600 people by 1860. Most of the 5 tribes who owned African slaves attempted to recreate the American South in the way they managed their plantations. They outlawed freed black men from the Cherokee Territory because it was inciting rebellion among other slaves. The brutal treatment these slaves endured would inspire the Cherokee Slave Revolt in 1842. This was the largest slave revolt against native slaveholders. A portion of the Civil War was fought in Oklahoma. The Union Army had suddenly left the Oklahoma Territory. Because of this abandonment by the Union, a refugee crisis gave way. The native population needed protection from the war. They also were in desperate need for food and medicine. The Confederacy knew that the tribes were vulnerable. So the Confederate Army made negotiations with all 5 tribes for horses and young, able-bodied men for the war. Soon, young Native men were fighting alongside Confederate soldiers on the battlefield. After the Civil War ended, the area was essentially the Wild West. The Native populations in Oklahoma Territory had been dealt a serious blow after the war, and they were struggling to recover.
This came to a part of the country that was not a part of the United States. These were 5 independent nations that signed agreements with a foreign government. There was not a single person that was living in the Cherokee Nation at the time that the war broke out that was not directly affected by this war. Most children had lost one or both parents. There were now orphanages in the Cherokee Nation, which we had never seen before. There was establishment of the first institutions for mental health. Those are all as a direct result of what happened in that war.
Groups of outlaws would murder and rob anyone they saw fit to fund their life in the vast, unforgiving prairie. The Dalton Gang, Jesse James, and Belle Starr are some names that gained fame during the time of the 1870s and 1880s. An area in southeast Oklahoma called Robbers Cave was a popular hideout spot for these famous outlaws. In 1871, the railroad finally pierced the border of the Oklahoma Territory and brought even more unwelcome white settlers. The people who would try to settle in the Indian Territory were called boomers. Not those boomers. These people would go on expeditions into the territory from Kansas and Arkansas and attempt to settle there. They would all eventually be caught and sent back to their home states. During this time, cowboys and cattlemen made negotiations with tribes to drive their cattle through Oklahoma land. The men who traveled through the land talked about how beautiful and lush it seemed. People far and wide were suddenly becoming interested in this mysterious place. People began pressuring Congress to open up the Oklahoma Territory for settlement. After several years of pressure, the announcement of the Oklahoma Land Rush was made. The federal government was going to open the Oklahoma Territory for settlement. Before the land run in 1889, Edmond was just a railroad station. In the 19th century, a steam engine without a tender, a car containing large quantities of water and fuel needed for traveling long distances, had to stop every 10 miles to collect water. So this place would be perfect for a railroad station. Surveyors would build a coal station and dig a water well. Before the town got its name in 1887, it was referred to as Mile Marker 103. The track would be built through the heart of the territory all the way down to Gainesville, Texas. The land run was one of the most important events in Oklahoma history. When they heard the gunfire at noon, April 22, 1889, that meant that the territory was officially open for business. At the time Black Americans participated in the land run, many of them would successfully stake their claims throughout the Indian Territory. Some of them were Sooners, people who snuck into the territory before the clock struck 12 in order to find the best land first. These were different from Boomers, who had been sneaking into native land for years before the land rush. It is unknown exactly how many Black Americans participated in the land run, because many white settlers did not want it to be known that Black people were living in their towns. The land run had given Black people hope of one day living equally to their white neighbor. Oklahoma was being called the promised land for Black people all over the country. The opportunity for settlement in Oklahoma for anyone gave hope to many black people back then. However, many white settlers were afraid of the competition black farmers would pose to their own farms, and afraid of what other white settlers would think about black families living in their towns. Black farmers were terrorized by white farmers near Norman because they were afraid that their cotton farms would be more successful than theirs. These white men began writing their racism into law, making it illegal for black families to even own land in several towns all over Oklahoma. With the passage of Jim Crow, many Oklahoma towns became even more hostile to minority residents and visitors. This awful treatment by white settlers led to several all-black towns being created. Towns like Langston, Tallahassee, Brooksville, and more. Edmond would go on to build the first school in the territory in September of 1889. The building still stands near downtown Edmond. Separate schools would be established for the black population. It was decided that these schools would be put in any district where the majority of voters supported it. Education would be important to all Edmondites. The black citizens especially were very invested in education. In 1892, Edmond opened a separate school for black children. It was less than a mile away from the white school. The school began with 22 black students. There was an enrollment of 15 students reported in 1899. The same year, Edmond built the Kingsley Schoolhouse, which would accommodate even more white students. The last year the separate school was open was in 1905, and 15 students were attending. William Sulzer was the principal for the separate school from 1895 to 1896. This man's contributions to education and training for black teachers would help to establish the historic Langston University. Charles D. Clem would take over as teacher of the separate school in 1898. He helped the school succeed under his leadership and fundraising efforts. He would later write a volume of poems in 1902 that would even be published in Edmond, a big deal for the time. He received praise for his work from people all over the town. In 1903, a student at the separate school named Carol Covington needed to pass the graduation exam. The only problem was that it was only available at the all-white schoolhouse. When she arrived to take her test, the white students whispered about her, and some even walked out because she was there. She was moved to a different room in the school to take the exam, but a member of the school board came shortly after to tell her she needed to leave and take the exam at the separate school. Carol was not deterred, and she successfully passed that exam and would become the very first student to graduate from the Edmond separate school. Victoria Saunders took over as principal at a very unfortunate time in Edmond's history. The black population in Edmond was declining quickly. She struggled to find enough students to enroll. There had to be at least 8 enrolled in order to keep the doors open. By 1905, the school had to close because there were no longer enough black students in Edmond to teach. Over the next several years, the population would continue to decline until 1920, when the black population in Edmond was 0. Edmond was slowly becoming one of the most affluent suburbs of Oklahoma City. The suburb is still known for housing the lower and middle classes as well as the wealthy. Edmond would have some of the most expensive real estate outside of Oklahoma City and Tulsa. Racial covenants were written into every plat of land in Edmond from 1911 until 1949. According to the Edmond Historical Society, they were unable to find any official records barring African Americans from entering Edmond, but a young black man named Edmond THREATT visited Edmond once and felt very unwelcome. Edmond THREATT was part of the prominent THREATT family that founded the THREATT filling station in 1915 in Luther. They were a safe place for black travelers passing through Oklahoma and a convenient place for the residents of Luther to get gas, food, groceries, and entertainment on the weekends. Edmond ran the restaurant and the club next door to the filling station. THREATT recounted his visit to Edmond in the Route 66 Companion by David King Dunaway. He remembered a sign on his way into town that read, "Don't let the sun set on you in this town." THREATT said that he went to a local restaurant called Royce Cafe, and he tried to order a sandwich. He was scolded and told to go around to the back of the store. THREATT decided he would rather just leave. THREATT's sister and his friends told him that they needed to hurry up. They were feeling afraid at this point. THREATT did not want to run, though. He took his time and got into his vehicle to leave. On his way out of town, though, he would be pulled over, and the officer would ask him why he was trying to stir up a little peace. Edmond tried to explain that all he asked for was to be sold some food and something to drink for his friends. THREATT did not want to be treated like a second-class citizen. The officer told him he better get out of town, and THREATT left, but not without feeling angered at his experience in the town he was named after.
The building next door it still belongs to our family. Grandfather's son, which is Edmond THREATT, he ran that as a barbecue restaurant and also as kind of like a club. So he ran that next door. Saturdays and Sunday, folks would come from Tulsa, Oklahoma City, all miles around because they know that on Saturday and Sunday they can go and see the Negro baseball players because teams would come from other towns to compete with one another. And they would drink, pop, beer, and eat, and just have fun.
Royce Cafe opened in 1934 and advertised their business and Edmond on a widely circulated postcard that said that it was an all-white town. Another account of discrimination was mentioned in a memoir by James Buzz Forsyth. He was a projectionist at 2 local theaters. He recalled that there was indeed sundown laws in town. There was one incident in the summer of 1951 when a black man purchased a movie ticket to get out of the summer heat while he waited for the bus to return. The police would arrive shortly after he went into the theater, and he was arrested and taken out of town. Buzz was 18 at the time, and he remembered feeling ashamed of what had happened to that man. Stella Barton Fordyce compiled one of the earliest histories of Edmond when she wrote her master's thesis on the history of Edmond in 1927. She interviewed the prominent Edmond historical figure Isaac Wesley Rodkey. He had been the owner of the famous Eagle Flouring Mill. It had been in Edmond since 1897 and remained one of the largest employers in town through World War I and later the Great Depression. He told Fordyce,
"Early in its history, Edmond passed an ordinance forbidding more black people to locate in the town. Gradually, those living there moved away. About 1905, they were told their numbers did not justify a separate school. Then sometime later, when only 2 black families remained in town, the citizens signed a petition asking that they move away. And they moved away without any disturbance."
Many people in Edmond did everything they could to keep the town's image of 100% whiteness intact. Students from the local college, business owners, and the Chamber of Commerce all boasted in advertisements for the town that it was 100% white. There was a disturbing article written in Vista, a student newspaper for the Central State Teachers College, or present-day UCO, about why Edmond was an ideal school town. It is quoted as saying that undesirable factors, those that should be absent from school towns, are the noise and grime of industries, an uneducated foreign element, a black element in white school town, pool halls, tobacco stores, and cheap, questionable forms of amusement. In Edmond, there are no ignorant foreign element to corrupt American ideas, no unschooled black element to increase crime. The Edmond Historical Society states that there were other similar articles boasting about the whiteness of Edmond. The Ku Klux Klan set up a chapter in Edmond in January of 1922. Their messaging resonated with many poor and wealthy citizens alike. Oklahomans were very receptive to the Klan at the time. Many had been fans of the film A Birth of a Nation. When the Klan offered magical ideas into their lives, it proved to be an escape that they had not found anywhere else. They would use several different churches to promote their ideas. In 1922, after the reverend at the First Christian Church in Edmond gave a sermon about the KKK, about what they are, why they are, and who are members, the KKK came in from the back of the church and handed a note to the pastor. The note read, "Reverend Ashley Farmhand, this organization is backing you in the work you are trying to do. We stand for strict enforcement of all moral and civil laws. No decent, law-abiding citizen has anything to fear from our organization. We are in Oklahoma, 70,000 strong. Right is might." In July of 1922, the Klan staged a parade in Edmond. It was at the time the largest crowd ever assembled in the town. The parade was led by a local woodsman from Oklahoma City. It was common for many men who were members of the Klan to also be a woodsman or a Freemason. The Klan also had a chapter in Norman. They put on a similar parade through the streets. This was to show the Klan's strength in the area. The KKK continued a reign of terror, especially at night. They created an atmosphere of fear that kept black people from even visiting certain towns in the daylight. In the 1920s, the Klan had a startling number of members all across the state. The Klan was particularly lawless around Tulsa and Okmulgee during this time. The governor of Oklahoma declared martial law in some counties and issued a ban on masks to help curb Klan violence. This was around the time that the Greenwood Massacre occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. The Klan would eventually lose their strength over the years. Many Oklahoma citizens did not agree with what the Klan was doing and were appalled at their attacks across the state. There began to be a rise in anti-KKK groups that started to push back against white supremacy in the area. Though they managed to survive in pockets, they were much less stronger than they once were. In November of 1937, this photo of the KKK appeared in the Oklahoman. It was taken in Edmond near present-day I-35 and 2nd Street. The photo was published with a snippet beneath that read, 275 Invisible. The white-robed brothers of the Invisible Empire rode again Wednesday night. This area today is a busy intersection that thousands of people drive by every day. And most of them have no idea that the Klan gathered here to burn a cross 85 years ago. Edmond and Norman are both college towns. Edmond has UCO, formerly the Normal School, formerly Central State College. Norman has Oklahoma University. Both universities fought integration for years. University of Oklahoma would not allow black people to attend until 1948. Soon, Oklahoma public schools began busing students into different schools within the school system in an attempt to integrate students. This fueled a white flight to the suburbs. In Edmond, the population erupted in 1960 and 1970 because of this. Throughout this time, Edmond remained 100% white. Black people were still not allowed to own property in Edmond and were still facing other forms of discrimination in the town. White residents had seen the mistreatment of their black peers at Central State College and elsewhere, and wanted to establish a chapter of the NAACP. Edmond had only white residents, so that meant that some of the first members would be white. In May of 1969, Spec Reynolds, an Edmond resident, and Henry Floyd, a member of the OKC NAACP, organized the group in Edmond. The newly founded Edmond NAACP released their goals for how they would integrate Edmond. In 1969, not long after their goals were published, a bomb was detonated outside the home of Spec Reynolds in downtown Edmond. No one was hurt, but he had a small crater in his yard. Some people were clearly not happy with the change that was coming to Edmond, but this would not deter them from their goal to make Edmond a better place for everyone to live in. In the 1970s, black people began moving back to Edmond, the first of which purchased a home in Edmond in 1976. Dr. Paul LEHMAN was a graduate of Central State College. He would be the first black professor at Central State College and the first black family to live in Edmond in several decades. Dr. Paul LEHMAN's son, Dr. Christopher LEHMAN, graduated from Edmond Memorial High School and is now a professor at St. Cloud State University. The LEHMAN family paved the way for other black families to integrate back into Edmond, Oklahoma. Royce's Cafe, the one that advertised Edmond's whiteness, would be a local hotspot for years in the town. They would even advertise that their food was supervised by women. The cafe opened in 1933, and Royce died in 1942. Cafe would continue to be a place where local clubs would meet and people would go for special occasions. They boasted about their chicken dinners, Dr. Pepper served hot and delicious pies. The very last year the cafe would remain open was 1970. Today, in 2021, the building that once housed the discriminatory cafe is now a medical marijuana dispensary called Graham Central Station. Edmond has changed a lot over the decades. The makeup of this town is still changing. However, many of the scars from these old racial wounds can still be seen and felt in Edmond today. Let me know what you think of the history of Oklahoma, and if you have any ideas for future topics, I would love to hear them. Leave me a comment or shoot me an email. Thanks for watching.